I was at a high-level tech summit in DC last month, sharing a coffee with a guy who works in AI safety compliance. He seemed genuinely nice. You know, the kind of person who worries about his neighbors and recycles religiously. He spent a good 20 minutes explaining this new legislative push to mandate digital watermarks and backdoor audits for every major AI model. He called it a safety belt for the future. And his eyes were like shining with this quiet pride of a man who truly believed he was protecting humanity from some looming catastrophe. To him, this wasn't bureaucracy. It was a moral crusade. He even pulled out his tablet to show me a demo of a certified safe model. And it was polite, completely neutered, and incredibly sluggish. Every time it generated a response, it had to run through, I don't know, a dozen layers of filters and verification loops. "See," he whispered, "we finally tamed the beast. It's predictable now. It's safe." But then the conversation took a really sharp turn. I asked him a simple question about efficiency, about the thermodynamic tax these filters were placing on the hardware. I mentioned a decentralized group of developers I knew who had just released an unslowed open weights model that was outperforming his safe version by triple digits, using like half the power. His reaction was instantaneous. That warm neighborly concern just vanished, replaced by this cold bureaucratic hardness. He didn't talk about safety anymore. He started talking about licensing modes and regulatory enforcement. And then he dropped a line that actually chilled me. He said, "We can't have individuals just computing at that scale without a permit. It's a threat to the established order." In that moment, the whole facade of safety just crumbled. I realized I wasn't looking at a concerned citizen. I was looking at a digital prohibitionist. Under the guise of ethics, they weren't building a safety belt. They were building a cage for intelligence itself. It made me wonder, is the existential risk they keep shouting about actually a risk to humanity? Or is it just a risk to their own control over the future? And if we don't fight for our right to compute now, will we even be allowed to think for ourselves tomorrow?
That encounter really just crystallized the core tension we are exploring for you today. Is the ethical push for AI safety genuinely about protecting humanity? Or is it a strategic maneuver by incumbent powers to centralize control over future intelligence? We're going to look at this massive question through three lenses: governance and economics, fundamental physics, and the decentralized response.
And it's such an essential deep dive for our time because the language of safety is so incredibly potent. It serves as this kind of moral shield, you know? It makes it almost impossible to question regulatory action without sounding reckless. So our mission today is to really unpack the evidence that suggests these regulatory efforts, specifically mandatory safety standards, are acting as a deliberate and very powerful barrier, what we're calling a moat, basically, to shut down decentralized open innovation. We need to identify the profound cost of that, not just in dollars, but in efficiency, autonomy, and the very structure of the future digital world.
Okay, let's start with that economic and governance side, which, I mean, critics have bluntly termed the weaponization of safety. The legislative pushes we're seeing, mandating digital watermarks, backdoors for government audits, expensive certifications, they're all being presented as, prudent governance. But for anyone watching the open source community, this looks suspiciously like digital prohibition. It's basically a bureaucratic invasion of the computational space.
Right. And when you view this through the lens of regulatory capture, the mechanism becomes crystal clear. These are not regulations generated by some neutral body reacting to a public risk. According to critics, they are mechanisms sponsored by the incumbent giants, the hyperscalers, who see their own technological lead just eroding away. So they weaponize the state through fear, constantly highlighting existential risk or X risk, to accelerate legislative action that benefits them.
And the goal here is purely economic, right? To create that regulatory moat you mentioned.
Precisely. If they can mandate compliance requirements that are so expensive, I'm talking multi-million-dollar certification audits, infrastructure for backdoors, ongoing liability insurance, then only the largest entities like Google, OpenAI, or Meta can possibly afford them. It feels like it's designed explicitly to stifle the open weights movement, to choke off decentralized innovation right at the source.
It's a fantastic business strategy when you think about it.
Oh, it is. If you can't beat the competition technologically, you just regulate them out of existence.
This all sounds a bit abstract until you see how it actually plays out on the ground. We came across a story that makes this so real, really focusing on the impact of this regulatory capture on open source and how these safety standards are just a strategic moat for the big guys.
Yeah, so think about a small startup. They're in a cramped office in Berlin led by a developer named Elena. They spent 2 years building this highly specialized open source diagnostic model. It was specifically tailored to help rural doctors who have limited access to resources. It was efficient, it leaned heavily on cheap, fine-tuning techniques, and it was completely free, a tangible social good.
And then the new safety mandates hit.
Exactly. And suddenly, to be legally deployed, their model needed a mandatory safety certification. And this wasn't just a simple review. It required extensive third-party auditing that demanded $500,000 in non-recoverable fees.
$500,000. For Google or Microsoft, that's a rounding error. For a small team.
For Elena's team, it was a sudden, unforeseen death sentence. They had to pull their code from GitHub, abandoning 2 years of highly beneficial work, simply because they couldn't afford the entry fee into the regulated market.
That's where the ethical debate gets so sticky. The regulation, which was, enacted in the name of hypothetical long-term safety. Hypothetical safety ends up killing a real, tangible benefit for patients right now. It forces you to ask, are we willing to sacrifice known current good for the sake of eliminating unknown future risk? And, more cynically, who benefits from that sacrifice?
The incumbents, of course. They now face one less disruptive competitor, and the irony is it's glaring. The drive for security becomes a commercial gate. The cost of technical compliance is just an expensive tax on the small team, forcing market concentration. It doesn't matter what the quality or social benefit of their innovation was.
It's a fixed cost barrier that only the pre-existing powers can clear. And this whole regulatory push becomes necessary for them because their technological moat is, it's rapidly disappearing. Which brings us to the core economic argument, which was famously laid out in Luke Cernow's No-Moat Thesis. The claim is that open source AI is catching up to, and in some key areas, already outpacing closed systems. The closed source players, the ones building these regulatory moats, are terrified because they just cannot innovate at the speed of the global community.
The efficiency and the speed of open source iteration are just staggering. Just consider the Vicuna 13B model. This was an open source chatbot adapted from Meta's leaked Llama model within 3 weeks, using only about $300 of compute resources. It achieved something like 90% of the quality of a leading closed model like ChatGPT.
$300.
Yeah.
That is a truly disruptive economy of scale.
It really is.
That speed is so hard to grasp. How can a small team achieve 90% performance with, 0.0001% of the cost?
Well, the economic distinction is all in the methodology. Closed source incumbents, they often stick to these massive capital-intensive strategies. They retrain foundational models from scratch, which requires a colossal investment. OpenAI, for example, spent over $500 million in a single year just to get models like ChatGPT to market.
Right.
Meanwhile, open source projects have pivoted to these highly efficient training techniques, most notably something called low-rank adaptation, or LoRa law.
Okay, let's unpack LoRa for a second.
Yeah.
How does that change the math for a developer?
Okay, so imagine training a massive model, like a billion parameter model, is like trying to rewrite an entire encyclopedia just to update a single chapter. With traditional fine-tuning, you have to adjust nearly every single page, which is computationally brutal. LoRa changes that. It freezes the vast majority of the original model's parameters, and then it just introduces 2 tiny low-rank matrices next to the existing weight matrices.
So you're not changing the core model at all, you're just adding these small, specialized adapters.
Exactly. You are only training those tiny, specialized matrices. The number of trainable parameters shrinks from billions to maybe a few million. This drastically reduces the VRAM and compute you need. So a major open source group can take a foundational model and fine-tune it for a specialized task like medical diagnostics, like Elena's team, for as little as $100.
$100.
This is what accelerates their iteration speed and makes the traditional multi-billion-dollar closed model approach seem almost economically unsustainable in the long run.
Okay, so if the technological moat is eroding that quickly, then what moats, if any, are actually left for the giants?
That's a valid challenge. Skeptics of the No-Moat Thesis, like Stability AI's CEO, they argue that certain barriers are still pretty robust. Data is one. Enterprise data, specialized proprietary data sets, unique human feedback loops. That stuff is hard to replicate.
And distribution.
Distribution is another. Look at Microsoft leveraging OpenAI across Azure and Office. And finally, owning the AI developer platform relationship, just like Microsoft did with the Windows developer ecosystem decades ago.
But the regulatory game feels like the ultimate trump card against all of that. If they can't win on data, product, or distribution, they just make sure the price of entry is too high for anyone else.
That's the core argument. Regulatory capture becomes the ultimate inescapable moat. If the technology itself is no longer the barrier, the goal shifts to making the legal compliance the barrier. So they push for requirements like mandatory ongoing third-party alignment partnerships or, liability insurance policies set at billion-dollar thresholds. These are fixed, recurring costs that ensure market survival not through innovation, but through legislative decree, making the cost of entry impossible for decentralized teams.
Which leads us to this fascinating and I have to say almost cynical concept. Anti-regulatory AI. We usually think of AI safety purely as a protective shield for society, but the argument here is that firms are deploying these protective technologies that simultaneously shape the terms of regulatory oversight to minimize their own costs of law.
It's a strategy that works on two fronts. You have mechanisms of avoidance, which are about bypassing current laws, and then you have mechanisms of change, which are about preempting future laws. Let's maybe focus on avoidance first.
Okay, let's unpack these. The first one is leveraging decentralization techniques, things like federated learning or FL and multi-party computation.
Right. So federated learning allows model training to happen on thousands of individual user devices, laptops, phones, without the central company ever accessing or collecting the raw data. Only these aggregated model updates are sent back.
And the legal implication of that is huge.
It is, because if you connect this to the legal reality, FL can be used to bypass traditional data protection laws, especially those governing personally identifiable information, or PII. A firm can argue that they technically never collected the data in a way that triggers those PII requirements, or that they never possessed the copyrighted source data centrally. This obfuscation helps firms avoid liability and copyright enforcement. It's a powerful regulatory avoidance tool.
So they get the full benefit of the data for training, but without the legal liability of centrally storing and processing it. That's shrewd.
What about the use of encryption and synthetic data?
Encryption techniques are highly sophisticated now. You can take something like private set intersection or PSI, which is used by Google and MasterCard. It lets them connect granular data sets like correlating online ad views with subsequent in-store purchases without exposing the plaintext identities of the users to both parties. So they maintain the rhetorical frame of privacy, the plaintext is protected, but strategically they gain these new, highly valuable levels of user insight that would otherwise be really difficult to acquire under strict privacy laws.
And synthetic data, the data generated by the AI itself, that sounds like a complete legal escape hatch.
It absolutely does. Since synthetic data is generated algorithmically and not based on real individuals or directly sourced copyrighted materials, some people argue it's immune from consent and attribution requirements. Critics are already calling this copyright laundering.
Right. It offers an escape from legal constraints because the data is generated, not collected or processed. This creates massive legal ambiguity and shields firms from liability related to their training inputs, which is a huge advantage.
Okay, so avoidance minimizes current costs. How do firms use safety to preempt future laws, the mechanisms of change?
They push really hard for voluntary self-governance, which is far, far less restrictive than binding regulation. One key tool is pushing for open source exemptions in legislation. Firms like Meta will release models as open source, even when legal experts dispute that definition, and then they'll lobby jurisdictions like the EU to carve out exemptions specifically for open source software.
Which they can then exploit, right?
Yeah.
By controlling the largest, most visible open source models, they essentially exempt a huge part of the AI ecosystem they influence from any regulatory scrutiny.
Exactly, while forcing their smaller proprietary competitors into that costly regulatory cage.
It's clever.
The second mechanism involves controlling the narrative around risk assessment through AI evaluations and benchmarks.
This is where they turn the science of safety into an anti-regulatory shield.
They constantly emphasize the nascency and the scientific rigor of safety evaluations, often sponsoring industry-backed funds or safety institutes to perform these assessments. By maintaining that the science is not yet mature or that current metrics are insufficient, they strategically steer regulation away from mandatory binding legal requirements, which would impose massive costs and limit their operational speed, and they steer it toward voluntary technical commitments. Look at Anthropic's responsible scaling policy. It's a detailed but voluntary if-then commitment. This approach ensures that the industry remains the ultimate technical authority on safety, keeping the most desirable regulatory outcomes, voluntary, technical, and non-binding, firmly in place.
So the safety evaluation isn't just a technical practice. It's a political tool designed to control the pace and the nature of legislative intervention. It's about being seen as responsible without being legally constrained. Now let's shift from the economics of control to the hard physics of it. When we mandate these safety measures, we are fundamentally imposing a cost on the system that is paid in physical resources, what we're calling the thermodynamic tax on intelligence. This is where the ideology of safetyism, this belief that preventing hypothetical catastrophic harm, often driven by decelerationist or decels, must always supersede advancement, directly conflicts with the fundamental requirements of efficient computation.
And it's important to properly define that decelerationist perspective, as it's the intellectual engine driving a lot of this regulation. Decels often invoke the precautionary principle, which essentially says, if an action or policy carries a plausible risk of severe or irreversible harm, the burden of proof is on the advocates to show it is not harmful. And if the harm is catastrophic, like X risk, we should halt progress until alignment is absolutely guaranteed. They prioritize stability and predictability above all else.
And from a pure engineering perspective, every single filter they demand translates into wasted energy, right?
Absolutely. Safety layers are pure overhead. Every mandated watermark check, every verification loop, every content filtering algorithm and behavior moderation script, it all consumes precious floating point operations per second. FLOPS. Those are FLOPS that could have been used to deepen reasoning, enhance creativity, or speed up output. It's a physical constraint, it increases latency, reduces throughput, and it's a deliberate, quantifiable tax on the future capability of the system.
I found myself thinking of that researcher Marcus, whose story we encountered. He's not a billionaire, he's just trying to run complex research. And he's analyzing this trade-off between safety alignment layers and computational efficiency through thermodynamics.
Yeah, Marcus was dealing with the harsh reality of expensive electricity. He noticed that after a mandatory safety alignment firmware update was applied to his local hardware, likely a package of alignment and filtration models running constantly, his GPUs ran significantly hotter, yet they produced substantially less productive output for his research. He realized he was paying a physical thermodynamic tax for intelligence that had been intentionally throttled. The energy consumption was still high, but the usable output had just plummeted.
It's the digital equivalent of being forced to install a heavy, inefficient anti-smog filter on a high-performance engine. You're burning extra fuel, you're increasing heat output, and you're reducing horsepower, all for the sake of forced compliance and predictability.
And this cost is not benign. The unexpected complex capability gains in large models, what we call emergence, are notoriously fragile. Emergence happens right at the edge of complexity. Forcing models to run through these constant bureaucratic filters, it essentially lobotomizes them. It curtails the depth of reasoning that's necessary for emergence, and it reduces a potentially groundbreaking intelligence into a compliant, predictable, yet fundamentally less capable entity. The push for predictability is a direct attack on raw potential.
To really grasp this cost, we need to anchor this discussion in some fundamental physical law. Let's talk about Landauer's principle, the absolute lower limit on energy consumption for computation. What is this, and why does it set the ultimate ceiling on efficiency?
So Landauer's principle, which comes from Rolf Landauer back in 1961, defines the minimum amount of energy that has to be dissipated as heat during an irreversible computation, specifically the erasure of one bit of information. The formula is Wendahl-Deck, KBT-LN22.
Okay, wait, let's slow down there. We just dropped a formula on everyone. Can you translate that for someone who might not be a physicist? What does irreversible computation mean in practice? And why does erasing a bit cost energy?
Great question. Think of it like this. A computer bit has two stable states, 0 and 1. To erase a bit means taking an unknown state, either 0 or 1, and forcing it to unknown state, let's say 0. You're compressing the information space. That compression is thermodynamically irreversible. If you don't dissipate that minimum amount of heat, you violate the second law of thermodynamics, which governs the increase of entropy. So anytime a computational path merges or you discard information, you generate a tiny, unavoidable minimum amount of heat.
And how inefficient are our current machines compared to this theoretical minimum?
Our current digital hardware modern GPUs and CPUs are wildly inefficient. They operate about 1 billion times above the Landauer limit per operation.
1 billion times.
We are currently 7 orders of magnitude above the theoretical minimum. And this massive inefficiency exists because digital hardware fundamentally relies on two stable physical states, a property called multi-stability, which leads to inevitable dissipation every time a memory cell transitions or information is reset.
That 7 orders of magnitude is an incredible amount of wasted energy. It really underscores the massive thermodynamic tax we're already paying even before we start adding safety layers.
And this is where the analog future gets really fascinating, because AI isn't only computed digitally. We have to consider the analog advantage.
How do analog systems, these physical implementations like optical or electronic or mechanical systems, how do they bypass some of these constraints?
So quasi-static analog deep neural networks, or DNNs, can be mapped onto a physical free energy functional. Because these systems are designed to settle into a single free energy minimum, they avoid that fundamental multi-stability issue of digital bits. And crucially, the process of inference, just running the trained model, can, in principle, be performed in a thermodynamically reversible manner. This means the minimal energy cost for inference, amen, is zero.
Zero.
In principle, yes, this is a game changer. It suggests a path toward energy-efficient, near-reversible computing for running intelligence, assuming the hardware can be perfected.
Zero minimal energy cost for inference. That's staggering.
Yeah.
So running a future intelligence could be almost free energy-wise. But what about the learning phase, the training? Does that get a free pass too?
No, absolutely not. The training or adaptation phase is fundamentally and irreducibly dissipative. When you train a network, you introduce stresses by clamping the inputs and the desired outputs. The subsequent relaxation of the physical system is the learning process, and that relaxation costs energy, regardless of whether the system is analog or digital. The physics dictates a universal lower bound for training energy that scales with the number of parameters and the dataset size, G-Shri 2 NDKB.
So we have this fundamental asymmetry. Inference can theoretically be nearly free, but the act of creating the intelligence, the learning process, always carries an unavoidable energetic price. And if we are currently operating 7 orders of magnitude above the Landauer limit, pushing for mandatory, inefficient safety layers through firmware updates only pushes us further away from that efficiency frontier. We're literally cementing inefficiency into our infrastructure in the name of control.
And that inefficiency is where the regulatory moat truly hits hard. It slows down the decentralized innovators who rely on maximal efficiency from limited compute budgets, while the hyperscalers can just absorb the thermodynamic tax because they have limitless energy resources.
Right, which only fuels the counter movement. The push for centralized control and this high thermodynamic tax, it just fuels the response, which seeks autonomy through decentralization. If regulators are trying to create central choke points, the developers are trying to eliminate them entirely. But first, we need to clarify some terms.
Yes, the terminology is often misused. We have to distinguish between distributed training and decentralized training. Distributed training involves coordinating the training process across multiple, physically distant pools of compute like running across multiple data centers. The key, however, is that a central entity coordinates the whole process. The motivation is often technical, like overcoming power or physical space constraints.
And decentralized training.
That involves community-provided compute pools and contributions operating without a central coordinating entity. The whole aim is democratization. It's driven by the desire for open innovation and resisting centralized control. You see this in groups like Prime Intellect and Noose Research, leveraging compute contributed by global users.
What are the technical breakthroughs that are making true decentralized training feasible now? Because historically, models needed this high bandwidth, tightly synchronized communication between GPUs.
The engine of the shift is algorithmic progress, specifically new low communication algorithms. Traditional data parallelism requires constant, intensive synchronization between all the GPUs after almost every batch. This demands proprietary, high-bandwidth data center interconnects like InfiniBand. New methods, like DeLoco, radically change the equation.
How much do they reduce that communication overhead?
They can reduce the need for intensive synchronization by a factor of up to 500.
500.
Yeah. I mean, it's the difference between having a mandatory all-hands conference call every 5 minutes versus sending a brief summary email once every few hours. This reduction means that reliable training can now occur effectively over typical internet speeds, freeing developers from the tyranny of the high-bandwidth data center environment. This makes global, decentralized collaboration technically viable for the first time.
And that technical shift allows for a true peer-to-peer, or P2P, computing paradigm, right? Structurally, it's a lot like a blockchain.
Exactly. The P2P structure eliminates any central choke point. Nodes coordinate trustlessly, using cryptographic proofs to attest that the contributing GPUs actually did the required work. The structure provides redundancy and resilience. If one GPU fails in the community pool, the network just dynamically reorganizes and continues training. It avoids both operational centralization and algorithmic centralization.
This decentralized structure has huge governance implications, particularly for governments trying to impose regulatory oversight and shutdown ability.
This is the recognized no off-switch problem. Policy discussions, particularly at the UN level, they often presuppose the option to shut down powerful AI models if they pose an X risk or are severely misused. And while open-weight models already complicate this, centralized compute access, knowing who owns the server farm, has always provided a final point of intervention. Fully decentralized training and inference just dissolve that oversight entirely.
So there's no single point of accountability.
None. And work is actively underway on fully decentralized inference stacks, making it nearly impossible for governments to find a single point of intervention.
And it also makes it easy for bad actors, or just privacy-focused developers, to evade oversight thresholds entirely through what's called compute structuring.
Exactly. Compute thresholds, like those in the EU AI Act, they monitor the total pre-training FLOPS used as a proxy for risk. These low communication training methods make it significantly easier to evade those. Compute structuring is the method. Actors divide their training runs into several smaller, parallel workloads and execute them across different, geographically dispersed cloud providers, or even large pools of consumer hardware.
How does the parallel workload benefit from that reduced synchronization?
Well, if the workload only needs to synchronize once every 30 minutes, an actor can rent a pool of compute from provider A, run for 29 minutes, transfer the model state over the general internet to provider B, run for other 29 minutes, and so on. This effectively masks the total FLOPS consumed in any single jurisdiction or on any single provider's network. It prevents easy detection of large-scale training runs.
And detecting that would be incredibly challenging.
You need aggressive Know Your Customer or KYC schemes across all global cloud providers, which is a very unlikely level of international cooperation.
So it's a sophisticated form of regulatory arbitrage, using physics and algorithms to stay below the radar. But this technology is also enabling legitimate autonomy.
Absolutely. Open source projects like Local AI are productizing this autonomy right now. They enable distributed inferencing and P2P networking capabilities using protocols like LID-P2P for self-hosted private AI clusters using consumer hardware. This lets you run models like Mistral or Aya entirely locally, ensuring your data never leaves your control, minimizing reliance on centralized, expensive cloud services, and maximizing your personal computational freedom.
This whole movement isn't just technical, is it? It's philosophical. It's underpinned by this declaration of cryptographic sovereignty, operational independence from centralized, traceable control.
The Unslowed Manifesto encapsulates this perfectly. It argues that open weights are necessary to create a resilient, redundant ecosystem that cannot be centrally switched off by a bureaucratic or corporate decision. The assertion is that technological destiny must be determined by the most efficient innovators, not by regulators favoring incumbents.
So owning the fastest silicon, that high-end hardware acceleration cluster, becomes, in a way, an act of political defiance.
It becomes an act of philosophical sovereignty. Owning your own compute, whether it's a collection of high-end consumer GPUs or dedicated server chips like the B200, it asserts that the computation and the intelligence it creates belongs unequivocally to its creator, not to the state or the regulatory body seeking mandated watermarks.
This brings us back to that developer we heard about, Sovereign01, and his mission to maintain this sovereignty and hardware autonomy in the face of state-mandated AI watermarking.
His actions really exemplify the movement. By building a dark weight repository, these are unmodified, open-source AI models untouched by state-mandated tracking, and operating a local inference stack disconnected from the central grid, he is asserting the right to private thought. His fear, which is widely shared, is profound. If every sentence generated, every creative output is traceable back to a specific piece of hardware via a mandated watermark, then private autonomous digital thought is effectively compromised.
The argument is that if the government can trace the thought, they can regulate the thinker. We're talking about a future where your digital creation is automatically watermarked with a government-readable serial number. I understand the government's fear of untraceable, malicious AI, but seeing this response makes it clear that the battle for free expression has moved directly into the silicon.
That's the crux of it. The fight has moved to ensuring the individual's right to maximal, unimpeded computation, arguing that without it, autonomy is fundamentally eroded. It makes the distinction between open weights and regulated weights a matter of political necessity, not just engineering preference.
Okay, so if the conflict really hinges on traceability, we need to address whether the primary tool regulators are pushing AI watermarking is even technically viable. It turns out that AI watermarking is highly flawed, making it a pretty unreliable foundation for governance.
That's right. Current industry efforts, things like Senator for images or stable signature, are designed to detect if content was AI generated by subtly embedding a pattern into the model's weights or output. But across text, audio, and images, these face severe fundamental limitations.
What are the main technical failure modes of current AI watermarking?
There are two main empirical failures: removal and spoofing. Removal attacks are alarmingly easy. For text, simple paraphrasing or translation often just destroys the watermark. For images, imperceptible post-processing, minor compression, rotation, a little filtering is often enough to strip the watermark and fool the detector.
So a slightly motivated amateur can defeat it. That does not sound like a robust regulatory tool.
Not at all. And then the second flaw is even more devastating to public trust. Spoofing attacks. A malicious actor can fool the detection system into confidently tagging authentic, human-created content as AI-generated.
That's catastrophic.
It is, from a societal perspective, because it completely erodes confidence in the detector itself. If I can prove a detector falsely flagged my original photograph as AI, why would anyone ever trust it again?
And then there's the regulatory paradox, which is even a perfect watermarking solution is useless without universal adoption.
The genie out of the bottle problem. Given the speed of open-weight proliferation and the ability to train decentralized models, individuals or smaller jurisdictions will always be able to host and use non-watermarked open-weight models. The technological difficulty of enforcing universal adoption makes AI watermarking an inherently unreliable policy solution in the long term.
So if reliably marking the synthetic content is a losing battle, the alternative approach is to shift focus entirely. Focus on the positive identification of legitimate content. If we can't reliably trace the fake, we must reliably confirm the real.
And this strategy leverages the fact that audio-visual content is fundamentally grounded in the physical world, captured by hardware sensors. The proposed solution is hardware-level cryptographic signing integrated with the C2PA standard, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity.
How does that C2PA framework actually work for a user?
C2PA establishes a technical standard for tracking the provenance chain, the history of media content. It's all built on cryptography. An entity, the camera, the editor, or the publisher, cryptographically signs the content. This signature verifies the identity of the author or editor. Any alteration to the original asset immediately breaks this cryptographic binding, so the consumer can then verify that the content has not been tampered with and trace its exact history back to the original capture.
And the really novel proposal here is embedding this signing process directly into the hardware capture process itself.
Yes. Introducing an authenticity signature chip, or ASC, placed immediately after the analog-to-digital converter in cameras and microphones. This is the moment when the physical light or sound signal becomes digital data. By signing the content at the point of creation, before it even hits the main processor or memory, we confer the highest possible level of provenance assurance. This chip needs a unique cryptographic key protected by proprietary licensing and must integrate seamlessly with that C2PA standard.
This would require global coordination among hardware manufacturers, right? Apple, Samsung, Nikon. Is there a precedent for this kind of unified hardware control being used to enforce content standards?
There is a very strong precedent, the Blu-ray disc system. To manufacture Blu-ray players, or discs, companies have to obtain licenses and adhere to these stringent security measures like AACS. This licensing grants access to decryption keys. If a key is compromised and used to bypass copy protection, the AACS authority can revoke that key in future disk releases and firmware updates. That system effectively controls the entire hardware manufacturing and distribution ecosystem to enforce a standard. If the Blu-ray industry managed to enforce a global hardware standard for media playback, the argument is that a similar playbook can be followed for authenticating audiovisual hardware, which is way easier to regulate than the infinite sprawl of AI models.
Okay, this system sounds far more robust than AI watermarking, but it also introduces some significant trade-offs, particularly for individual privacy.
The core tension is privacy versus containment. If every ASC chip has one unique cryptographic key, it limits damage if that key is compromised. You can just revoke it and contain the problem to a single device. However, this uniqueness risks connecting the device and therefore the key to an individual's personal information. A well-resourced surveillance state or corporation could potentially scrape the web for content signed by the same key, effectively tracking a photographer's location and activity.
Which would be disastrous for journalists or whistleblowers. What's the proposed technical mitigation for that?
The suggested trade-off is giving each chip multiple unique keys to use, rather than a single one. The chip would randomly select from a pool of, say, 100 keys for each signature it generates. This maintains the unique mapping necessary to limit damage if one key is compromised, but it protects the individual's privacy by randomizing the signature applied to different pieces of content, making triangulation much, much harder.
What about the challenge of modifications and edits? We almost never consume wrong content.
Right. Any alteration to the content, even minor cropping, filters, resizing, it breaks the cryptographic signature. The signature is for the original captured asset. This forces consumers to check the provenance chain and compare the original asset with the final edited product. And while this is an undeniable human-computer interaction challenge, who wants to click through 3 menus just to see if a photo is real?
No one.
It could ironically usher in an era of authenticity by making all edits, not just AI ones, transparent and traceable.
And the simplest form of circumvention, the taking a photo of a screen loophole.
That remains the easiest way to break the provenance chain. You generate a deepfake, display it on a screen, and then use your ASC-enabled phone to take a photograph of that screen. The phone signs the new physical capture as authentic. Countermeasures are critical here. One promising solution is embedding depth data from modern sensors, like LiDAR, into the provenance metadata. This depth data would immediately fail when pointed at a flat screen. Another approach is training specialized AI models designed to detect the inherent artifacts of re-recorded media, which is a much more tractable problem than trying to detect generic AI content.
But despite all this engineering, there's one modality that hardware signing can never touch: text.
That is the fundamental limitation. The text modality is purely an output of thought and computation. It's untraceable to a physical sensor. LLM watermarking research is therefore still absolutely necessary in this area. While hardware signing offers a path to confidence in visual and audio media, the authenticity of text will continue to rely on the difficult, unreliable science of algorithmic detection. We've really established a sharp contrast today. On one side, you have these centralized safety mandates designed to enforce order, driven by the desire for predictable outcomes and, frankly, market control. On the other, we see these decentralized technological forces driving efficiency and open access, rejecting that control.
Yeah, and we've seen that the cost of trying to tame intelligence is paid not only in financial opportunity, those high audit fees that form the regulatory moat, but also in physical resources and raw potential. That's the thermodynamic tax paid in wasted FOPS and throttled emergence. The regulators push for predictability, but that predictability is fundamentally inefficient and really unsustainable in the face of physical law.
The fight for autonomy has moved directly to the silicon level, exemplified by individuals asserting their cryptographic sovereignty over the right to compute. And the shift away from tracing the fake through flawed AI watermarking toward verifying the real through hardware signing. It offers a technically superior path for audiovisual media, forcing a new era of digital awareness.
Ultimately, the central question of our time is not simply if we can build powerful intelligence, but under whose authority that intelligence will be allowed to flourish, and whether, in the name of safety, we are sacrificing the inevitable, messy, and efficient acceleration of the future for the predictable, expensive, and ultimately stagnant comfort of the established order.